Well,
No,
here's Russ in his study,
I just,
and I'd like to talk to you, Russ, a little bit about the game of 1972 when Westmont College were the national champions. And before we do, could you just read a roster of who was, if you can remember, who was on the bus that year with you?
well, George, I had an unusual coaching philosophy in that I never cut a player. If he stayed out through preseason and through all the other tests that I put them through, they were on the team. They were listed as part of the varsity, even though I had a varsity and the leftovers were made up our junior varsity team. So I included every young man that came out and participated and wanted to participate on the Westmont College soccer team. I didn't cut anyone, they cut themselves. So, George, we had a fairly large roster to start with. But before we had a few weeks in, I found that a number of players seemed to have a lot more homework and other responsibilities that they dropped off on themselves. And so we ended up, I'll kind of name the starting lineup and a few of the subs that I use quite a bit. To begin with, we were fortunate to have a very fine returning team and a few good new players to make up the 72 squad. In goalkeeping was Gary Allison, and Gary was named the most valuable player of the national tournament. He played a fantastic game. He went on to play professionally, and he also, of course, was a great leader on the field. And during the 1972 championship games, he made some incredible saves and on a field that was difficult. We played at a small high school field that they had to enlarge to make it a minimum soccer field. Football field is like 55 yards wide, whereas the soccer team is 65 yards. That's minimum. Usually it's 75 yards wide. And so we had to adjust, and the field at Dunn, North Carolina High School was quite narrow. That is, they barely got the football field in, and now we had to expand it. And so we went off, in some cases, over a little bit of an edge so that it wasn't flat in those places. And in some places where the football field had ended and just a few feet further, it got very muddy and slushy. So we had a different challenge. I mean, especially when you think this is for the national championship, you kind of expected something a little bit better in terms of the field. Now, to complicate things, the first game was fine in terms of field conditions. The poor lighting didn't help any. I felt sorry for Gary, our goalkeeper, because there were shadows coming out of the one corner, and it was hard to see because the lighting was made for football, not for soccer. And so he had to deal with that, which I commend him for having such a great job and being able to be so able to block a lot of shots coming out of these dark shadows. And so we're really pleased whenever we played during the daytime. Some of the games were played, a lot of them were played at night, and some were daytime. Well, the first match went well for us. We played.
Who was on your team? Can you give
Yeah,
us the names
yeah. I
before
was
we
just
go
going to
on?
give you our starting lineup. The first game was against Fredonia University, and my starting lineup with a group of young men that played very well during the regular season. It was one of those unusual years for a coach when none of my players got seriously injured. So I wasn't having to replace a starter with a substitute. And they did a remarkable job. And I was so grateful that I didn't have a lot of injuries that particular year. Now, Dunn, North Carolina is hardly the Rose Bowl of soccer. It was a field that was too narrow. We had to widen it, which then made it a little rough on the edges. Um, it was short in the sense that most soccer fields are 120 yards in length, and the football field is 100 yards. So we had to get 20 yards extra, which pushed us into areas that weren't very stable. So all of a sudden, we're up against not just an opponent, but the field conditions, because our team depended upon short passing, good passing, firm passing, and it was hard to operate on a field that had rough areas and places where it was difficult. And then to complicate matters, after we won our first match against Fredonia, we advanced to the semifinals, meeting a defending national champion, Quincy College from Illinois. They were in a hotbed of recruiting for soccer players in the St. Louis area, and they were perennially a possible champion of both NC2A and NAIA. Well, we were to meet Quincy College in the semifinals. Quincy, I'm sure the coach looked at us and wondered how we did so well this year. He did say to his players, now these fellows don't play in the rain much. We play a lot. And it had rained heavily to the point where the field was literally looked like a lake. There was no place where you could see the sod or the grass. It was covered in water. It looked just like a lake. And a New York Times reporter said, I looked at that field and I said to myself, there's no way they could play a soccer match there. And then I found out they were going to play. Impossible, I thought. And so we looked at it, and indeed, when you looked out, all there was water. And we had a choice in a coach's meeting as to whether to delay it one day to give it a little more chance to drain and for people to bring in equipment to try to dry off the field as much as possible. However, the Quincy coach, who plays in the rain, figured Westmont in the Southern California rarely plays in rain. Therefore, it's our advantage to play in this terrible condition.
It's like having a horse race when one of your horses is what's called a mudder. Yeah. He can run in the mud,
right?
And they figured you guys couldn't run in the mud.
Exactly.
By the way, who were your guys? Before we go on,
well,
you have a list there, I think.
Well, I do. Well, let me give you the starting lineup.
Okay.
Gary Allison was our goalkeeper.
Mm-hmm.
Gary ended up being the MVP of the tournament.
Who else was on the team?
Then my fullbacks, we had Tim Quick at one fullback. We had Tom Dawson, one of my co-captains. He played center back. Then we had Ray DeVries, the other fullback. At midfield, I had Steve Kellogg, one of our co-captains. We had Sal Ornelas from our area in Santa Barbara. He was a midfielder. And then Ben Mashila, who was a Kenyan, who went to a school in Kenya where we recruited a number of missionary kids, and Ben was one of them, and he was an outstanding player himself. Then we had what we called a trailer, and John Paul Verhees from Holland was playing in that particular position because I wanted him to be able to rove from one place to the other. He was our key scorer, and he was a very talented soccer player, went on to play professionally. And John Paul he always amused me because of his accent and because of things that he would do. But I'll have to tell you one quick story. Can I insert this? We had a day off in Dunn, North Carolina between games, and guys went off walking in the neighborhood, and John Paul was one of them. And I went for a walk, and when I came by in this neighborhood, there was John Paul talking to this woman from Dunn. He was up on her porch, and he was engaged in a very serious conversation. He was listening and paying attention to her, and finally, so I waited for him. I thought I'd walk back to our dorm, and when John Paul joined me, I said, John, it looked like you were having quite a conversation with this woman. I know I heard you were, I saw some of these nuts that she grows, and one of them was out near the sidewalk, and you had picked up a few, and then she gave you a whole bag full. Is that true? Yes, yeah, she was so nice. And I said, well, Jean, you were so engaged in that, his coach. Let me tell you something. I didn't understand a word she said. I just smiled.
You'd be a good diplomat.
Yes.
Who else was on the team?
Well, as I said, Jerry, and then I gave you the fullbacks already. And at midfield, we had two midfielders, Ben Machila, Steve Kellogg, one of our co-captains, and Sal Ornelas was in the middle. And then the trailers, I started to say, but that was John Paul Verdes. He was a man that could move either side and was free to do that as part of our strategy. And then the three up front, we had Lloyd Gay, who was a 6'3" striker for me. He was the brother of one of my best players ever, Steve Gay. Steve went on to play on the U.S. Olympic team and actually became a member of the Olympic selection team. But Lloyd was a good player. He was 6'3", gets up high in the air on a cross. And then Paul Tegenfeld was on my right wing. Paul was amazing. He grew up as a missionary kid in India, but Paul could deliver a ball where I wanted it on a corner kick. In fact, people were astounded to know that in the corner kicks that we took during the year, on 49% of those corner kicks, we scored a goal. I had a series of different patterns that our guys would run. We'd call out a number, 1, 2, and it goes up to 15. And second half, I'd change it. So we'd say, all right, we're using the second digit or third digit. So if we say 315, it was third digit, it's play number 5. And the players knew it, but the other team couldn't pick up what we were doing because we repeated some of the corner kicks that were most effective.
Kept them guessing.
Yes, we did. And they didn't quite know what to have because we ran all these different patterns. So every corner kick, we're running a different pattern. And in one pattern, for example, I have guys right near the goalkeeper, 3 of them. They run towards the man taking the corner kick. Meanwhile, there's another player coming up by the goalkeeper. He can't touch him, but he's up there by him and hinders him a bit. And then we have 3 more guys. As they vacate, they're coming in. The corner kick man knows that particular play, he hits it low, about knee high, and they jump over the ball. They screen the ball. The players can't see it. He jumps up, it goes under them, and then these 3 more guys coming in from different directions, and we scored a lot of goals on that one.
That's a complicated play.
Well, you haven't even seen some of them because we had skip hitters. We just had numerous ways. And play. If we got scouted by someone, they'd find it very difficult to play against or guard against the number of plays we had because we had 15 that we could run and run well. And every practice we worked on those. And so, as I said, unheard of, but in 49% of our corner kicks we scored. And of course, I had some very good players too.
Well. Is that about the whole lineup then that went?
Well, I gave you pretty much the full lineup. I just finished with the front line. We talked about the defenders.
Well, tell me about the last game when you finally had the championship. There were a lot of games before that, and by the way, there's an interview with you that I did last Saturday that's very detailed for anybody who wants to see it. It's on YouTube. Coach Russ Carr, and they can find you there. So tell me about the last game when you took the national championship.
Well, George, I will tell you that, but I'll give you a quickie on the semifinal game because that was a key game.
Okay.
That thrust us into the finals of the playoff. And that was against Quincy College, the defending champion. They were favored to win the national championship as they had before. And this is when the field was covered with water. It was, literally looked like a lake. the New York Times reporter, as I said, says there's no way they can play on. And then afterwards, he said that was one of the finest soccer games I've ever seen. And we're playing literally on standing water, and against an outstanding team who often plays in wet weather, as opposed to Westmont, who rarely plays in wet weather.
Santa Barbara's pretty dry.
Yes, but this particular year was an unusual year. We played several matches in the rain, and that's never had been anything we did. Maybe once a season we'd have one game in the rain, but in this case we had several games, and we adjusted to the kinds of tactics that you use. You play it differently in wet weather because the ball skips, it gets in puddles. And so we do a lot of short passing and quick passing. And you know that if he gives you a lead pass, it's going to go a lot longer than normal. And so it's just all part of knowing your own team members and what they know and what they will do. And our guys adapted so well to that. As I said, that New York Times reporter says, I didn't think there'd be a way for them to play, but it was it was one of the finest soccer matches I've ever seen.
What was the highlight of that game?
Well, the highlight, I guess you'd have to say, was we won the game.
What was the score? Do you remember?
Right, it was 2-0 against the defending champions, Quincy College from Illinois. And then the final match was played against another defending champion from a year before, Davis and Elkins from West Virginia. They had a lot of foreign players, excellent players. They dominated the whole East Coast in their schedule, and they were good players, solid players, and a good coach. I'm sure they felt they had it made when they were to play Westmont, because they knew of Westmont and knew that we rarely played in this wet weather. Plus, our team had been to the Nationals many years in a row, and we never won it. We came close sometimes, but we lost early on to some very good teams. But we had all this experience. Every year we were able to win not only our district but the regionals to qualify to go to the Nationals, 11 years in a row. And so Westmont was a known quantity, and they knew that we were weak in certain areas. We didn't have quite the quality that some of these others had. And so I know that Davis and Elkins figured, we got this one made. Well, they didn't have it made. Our guys played brilliantly and won 2-0 against this.
2-0.
2-0.
I remember that team.
No, I'm sorry, George, that was the semifinal with Quincy. 2-1.
2-1.
And it was
That's
an overtime match. We went into overtime, and we won it in sudden death overtime. And it was a great moment because it was Westmont College's first national title ever. And our guys played their hearts out. And I just can't say enough for the dedication they had, the work they put in early before we ever got to the Nationals. We had this motto that we never get up. And there were many times that season we were behind early on in the game, and they came back and won. We actually lost one game during the season, and that was to Chico State University. And I'll have to tell you about this because the coach there, Don Beatty, is a good friend of mine. We were playing in the Chico State tourney at Chico, and we were in the finals with Chico State of the tournament. And it was tied at the end of the regular time. We went into overtime. Now it was sudden death. First team to score wins. We had several almost point blank shots at goal, which would have won the game for us. And one of my best players, top scorer, missed a point open goal shot and hit the post, came back. He tried to refine it instead of just putting it in. And the game would have been over. Well, we were in the second overtime period, and Don substituted a player. And they picked off one of our passes and sent it downfield. And this player was racing down there, and another player was handling the ball. They were ahead of us, they got ahead of us, and our defenders were rushing back to defend. Gary was getting ready in the goal, and this player then shot as he got close to the goal. Gary makes a terrific save and tips the ball that hits the crossbar and comes up. And this player Don had substituted never saw the ball. It came out and hit him in the head and went in the goal, and they won. That was our only loss.
That was a lucky win for the other team.
Well, it was.
How did you get so many great players at Westmont? Did you offer big scholarships or something?
I wish I had scholarships. I didn't have any to begin with, and then we were able to get one or two. And as much as possible, we would find players like missionary kids who had needs, and they could qualify for a regular needs scholarship. I only had one scholarship, and later, when I was leaving the college, they ended up giving me the same number as basketball, who had 10 scholarships. I didn't have any until my last year, and only one or two then. And then they upped it to try to encourage me to keep on recruiting and doing that. I had no trouble recruiting players. They wanted to come to Westmont. It's a beautiful campus. We played top-notch soccer. Little Westmont had a schedule with major colleges. We played UCLA, USC, University of Southern California, Cal State Fullerton, San Diego State, Stanford. Went up and played Oregon and Washington. Played Air Force Academy on a home field. BYU, University of Wisconsin. I got that far out to BYU, and I went on to Wisconsin because I knew the coach there. And so those are the teams we played, plus our NAIA schedule, which would be Biola and some other fine teams. There's some very good teams in NAIA. And so I loaded my schedule because I had this philosophy: you play the best to become the best.
Yeah.
And
you did. You know, for the guys that are listening to this at the event now, celebrating the win of 1972, do you have anything that mementos for them that they can take home with them?
Well, George, one of the things that I kept reminding them was that we will never give up. I don't care if we're down 5 goals with 1 minute left. Never, never give up. And I would quote Sir Winston Churchill when he addressed this group of students in the secondary school where many of their diplomats came from. It was just about the time that England was expecting Germany to invade them. And Winston Churchill was known for his wonderful speeches. Got up in front and he went and looked at the crowd side to side without saying a word. And then he spoke. Never, never, never give up. And that was the shortest speech he ever made. That's what
one of the most famous too.
And really.
By the way, I was at Westmont College. First time I was there, I was a little bit surprised. Russ Carr Field. There was, so you're going to go down in Westmont's history there because there's a field named after you. Well, we're going to have to conclude this. Any last, by the way, your soccer not just won the national championship, but it's won, I would say, countless souls to the kingdom of Christ through soccer. It begins with the ball, and you founded Sports Outreach, which is now an international mission, and all started with, it began with the ball.
It did, George, and I found that I was asked to take different U.S. teams on tours to South America, to Latin America, and to actually Africa. We toured Africa for 10 weeks and went from west to east in Africa, and also on to other countries, both in Europe and throughout a good part of our world. And one of the things that I noted as we were working with children a lot, not only were we playing matches on these tours, but we also did some work with youth in these different countries. And it was remarkable how easily you could attract the kids by just rolling out a ball. And the first thing you know, we're all playing with a ball, and then we set up and begin to train them in certain techniques. And the amazing thing was, I remember in Guatemala, uh, we had a little time to kill, and um, we went out on a little grass field nearby the hotel, and just wanted to loosen up a little bit. And before long, we had 50 kids there. And they wanted to participate, and so we did, and we had a wonderful time. And I will have to throw this in, George, because I just want to know that we were able to minister through soccer. And this particular time, I was coaching a U.S. team playing in Guatemala against their national team. And we were staying in this hotel. And one night, the players wanted to go for a little walk, but it was kind of dangerous, they said, be careful. And so we went as a group. And as we went past the hotel in the alleyway there, I saw some movement. And after he'd warned us that there are people that will do anything to rob you and might even take your life. But we had a crowd of guys, and I looked in there, and they turned out to be a bunch of little kids. They were living
throwaways?
in the alleyway next to the hotel.
I've heard of them.
And they were living in these cardboard boxes. It was cold. They were chilled. And our guys saw them, and they said, Coach, we got to do something for these kids. And I said, absolutely. My heart went out to them as the hearts of these players. And so we brought about 10 of them from that alleyway and walked them to the hotel door. But the doorman would not let us in because he recognized these children. They were full of rags, and they smelled and all kinds of stuff. And I said, well, sir, they're our guests. Please let us in. And he said, just a moment. He called security. And the security came and said, sir, they're not allowed in here. So they went back, and I said, you stay here, we'll be back. And guys went up and got some warm clothing, blankets, and other things, food, and we brought it out to them and invited them to go to the game that was going to be played the next day in the National Stadium. And so they show up in their rags and all, and we were getting ready to go on the bus, and we put the kids on first to make sure that they try to say, no, yes, there are guests. Oh, okay. And so the kids got on the bus, and when we got to the stadium, the neat thing was this, that when we ran onto the stadium floor, we let the kids run with us in the National Stadium.
They'll remember that all their
Well,
lives.
they will. And so they put extra benches in. The kids got to sit behind us in the National Stadium, and they'll never forget that. And the guys said, Coach, we got to do something for them. These kids are hungry. They're digging in the garbage cans for food. And so we collected some money, and we had this man that we trusted to buy them shoe shine kits so they could do some work and earn some money. And so that was one of the highlights of our time together. Just
you settled in Uganda, though. I think you settled in there after Idi Amin was overthrown. The country was in shambles, and you started sports outreach over there. Then later on, you went into soccer, from soccer to chess, for some of the people who couldn't play soccer. And didn't Walt Disney Studios do a movie on one of the chess students from there? What's the movie called?
Queen of Kotway.
The Queen of Kotway.
The Queen of Kotway. Kotway is one of the slum areas of Uganda. We identified 12 large slums.
Kind of
Uganda.
a cynical title, A Queen of the Worst Place.
Yes.
And it went on to be a movie and a book, and it just shows how you brought hope, whether it was in chess or in soccer. And by the way, the chess, that's still going on, isn't it?
Oh, yes, absolutely. In fact, the young man who worked with Fiona, the one who became the Queen of Kotway.
Is that Robert Katende?
Robert Katende was with me just yesterday, and we had a wonderful time. And you might be interested in knowing how Robert and I met. Robert was in one of the slums, and he was one of our staff members who came from a very difficult background. He he was an orphan. He was raised by people that weren't the kindest people in the world, and he went through some very difficult times as a student. But he was also a very fine soccer player, and so he got drafted by some of our slum teams to be on one of the teams that we were financing. And Robert um, came to me and said, "Coach, you know, I'm working in one slum, and a lot of the kids play soccer, and we're officiating it and so on. But there's a whole group of kids sitting down, watching as spectators of this game, and they don't want to play soccer." And he said, "I was wondering what to do with them." And I went home that night and I prayed, and I looked up on my dresser drawer, and there's my chess set. And I thought to myself, I wonder if these kids that are not playing would take to chess. And so Robert came to me and said, "Coach, I'm trying to think of something to do with these kids that aren't participating, and I've thought about chess. What do you think?" And I said to Robert, "Robert, I don't normally associate chess with slum kids. You usually think of these prep schools and young men and women playing soccer, or playing, sorry, playing chess. And yet, Robert, if that's what the Lord is speaking to you about, let's try it." And so Robert had his one set, and he began training them. And I said, "Robert, you're going to need a lot of sets. Look at all the people that have come out." And so as soon as I got home to the U.S., I happened to be in the dollar store. And up on the shelf, up high, where you could barely see them, were some chess sets, little boxes full of pieces and a rather flimsy chessboard. I bought every one they had, 35. And the next time we went over, we took those. And then a good friend of mine who also accompanied me, one of my former teammates in college, he also did the same thing in Oregon, and he brought some. And so we suddenly had 70 of these chess sets, but the boards were pretty flimsy. Well, this one couple, again, close friends of mine who did woodworking, reinforced all these chess boards so they would hold up and not just fall apart simply. So that's how chess got started. And then the interesting thing happened when they were playing chess. They sat all over the area that we were in the church. They were playing chess. Outside the church, they're playing chess. In the hallways, they're playing chess. And one day, this young girl, whose brother told her about a feeding program we had, and that she should come because they had very little food. So this girl, Fiona, came and went to our feeding station and got a meal free. And she was impressed and liked it. But then when she was ready to return home, she saw these kids playing chess. She said, "What's that? What are they doing?" Someone explained to her, and she suddenly got fascinated by it. And so the next day she came back and she wanted to learn how to play chess. And she had an aptitude that was incredible. She could somehow, once she learned how the pieces move, she suddenly saw it all. And before long, she was entered into a tournament locally in Kampala. She won the tournament amongst the females. Later, she won tournaments with both males and females, and she got selected to go to a tournament in another country. In fact, one of the countries was China, and she had never traveled. I mean, it's hardly ever she even got to travel in a car or a bus, but to travel on an airplane, that's something else. A jet plane, and she used to see them going overhead, and she was, first of all, scared to death, but secondly, amazed at what they could do in flying above, because she used to see the planes, but she never knew what it was like. And to be on a plane going to China, of all places, and to a place where chess was honored greatly. And she learned a lot there and won a tournament there. And people realize now this girl is very talented. And as you just mentioned a moment ago, Fiona went on to represent her country in a chess tournament and did very well, came back a heroine. And the country was so proud of her. And she went on to get scholarships to go to school. And she became not this dumb young student because she hadn't gone to school. And now she was going to school, and all of a sudden she just blossomed. And as you said, a book was written about her, and then later Walt Disney made a movie out of her.
I was talking to Fiona, and she gave me an insight on slum kids in chess. She said the same skills that allowed me to survive the daily life in the slum allowed me to survive the chessboard. She said, your mind thinks the same way. How do you survive this situation? And the chessboard, well, that's how they survived it. Well, we've gone over time, but you're a fascinating man, Russ, and we'll take up some other stories in the near future. But thank you for visiting with me today and for your message to the winning soccer team, national champions of 1972.
My final word is, gentlemen and ladies and gentlemen, if there's more than just the males there, may I just urge you to follow the Lord, to honor him, to please him. We're in a world that has great need of Jesus Christ. He's the answer. Vaccines and all the other things that they come up with, they might be good and helpful, but in the long run, the true answer is one you hold if you are a follower of Christ. And you need to proclaim him. You need to stand firm and go on the offensive instead of the defensive. And you can do that. You've got 3 weapons, and I'll leave you with this. You've got God's word, the Bible. It's powerful. Just, all the miracles that Christ performed, all the miracles that took place in the Old Testament. And what about the miracles in your own life? And then we have prayer. Prayer is a powerful tool. Nothing can stop prayer. They can try to tell you you can't pray in the schools, you can't pray here, but that can't stop you from praying. Prayer is a powerful weapon, and God answers prayer. I'll tell you one quick story. I've said it before, but my wife, I could always remember we were in a school where they were going actually bankrupt, and they couldn't pay us. My young daughter at that time, 2 years old, she outgrew her shoes. And Sue was praying, so she's catching cold. Cold floors, November in Spokane, Washington. And so Sue prays, and she no longer finishes. Then suddenly, a knock on the door. And she gets up, says, who could that be? School's in session. Usually a lot of students came by after school, but not during school. And when she opened the door, there was a well-dressed woman, nicely dressed. And the woman had something in her hand, and she had it behind her back. And then she pulled it up and says, Madam, do you know anyone who could use these pair of shoes? She thanked this woman, who we never saw her before or since. We're sure it was an angel. Those shoes perfectly fit Jill. It just was one example of God's faithfulness to us. And that whole year in that school that went bankrupt and couldn't pay us, somehow we managed to get through. I could tell you story after story, which I won't, George, and how God taught me more on faith than in any other academy of learning about faith, because we trusted him even when it didn't make sense. And I like to urge our audience that you learn to trust the Lord. Remember the verse, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not upon your own understanding. In all your ways, acknowledge him and he will direct your path. And know this, trust him even when it doesn't make sense. God bless you.
Thank you so much. Coach Russ Carr, championship coach, 1972, a champion for Christ. Thanks for spending your time with me.